Geronimo was a violent warrior, but the rage that fueled him didn't come from conquest. It came from loss. In 1851, while he was away trading with other Apache men, Mexican soldiers attacked his camp without warning. They slaughtered everyone they found, including his wife Alopa, their 3 children, and his mother. When he returned and saw the bodies, something inside him broke. He buried them himself, and then he made a vow, not to his people, but to the dead, that he would spend the rest of his life making the enemy feel the same terror they had inflicted on his family. Geronimo wasn't born a chief, and he didn't rise through politics or negotiation. What made him a legend was something far simpler and far more terrifying: his refusal to die and his ability to make others do just that. After the massacre, he led a small band of Apache warriors deep into Sonora, launching raid after raid against Mexican patrols, settlements, and forts. He didn't strike at random. He studied their movements, learned their weaknesses, and attacked with surgical precision, often slipping into heavily guarded outposts under cover of night, killing with such silence and speed that the soldiers never even had time to scream. As the years passed, the Mexican government grew desperate. They fortified towns, offered bounties, and sent wave after wave of cavalry to stop him. But it didn't matter. Geronimo could vanish into the desert like smoke. He knew every canyon, every watering hole, and every blind spot in the mountains. When they thought they had him cornered, he would reappear 50 miles away, striking again, and then disappearing once more. Survivors began telling stories, claiming he couldn't be killed, that bullets passed through him, or that he was protected by some dark magic. Even his own people began to believe he had supernatural power. But the truth was far more dangerous. He was just smarter, faster, and more determined than anyone who came after him. And then the Americans arrived. By the 1870s, white settlers had begun pushing into Apache territory, and the U.S. government, using the same tactics it had used against countless other tribes, offered peace in exchange for relocation. The Apache were promised food, protection, and the right to live in peace, promises that meant nothing once they were moved to the San Carlos Reservation in Arizona. The conditions were brutal. The land was barren, the food was spoiled, and the medicine, when it came at all, arrived too late. San Carlos became known as Hell's 40 Acres, and Geronimo wasn't interested in waiting around to die. So he left. When Geronimo broke out of San Carlos, he didn't just disappear. He declared war. He didn't lead hundreds of warriors or command a vast force. At times, he had fewer than 40 people with him, and many of them were women and children. But what he did have was knowledge of the land, the will to survive, and a hatred that burned hotter than any army's resolve. From the Sierra Madre to the Arizona Territory, he led raids that struck with such speed and precision that entire towns lived in fear, knowing he could be watching from the cliffs, waiting for a moment of weakness. The United States couldn't tolerate the embarrassment. This wasn't just about Apache resistance anymore. It was about pride. In 1885, after one final breakout, the U.S. government sent 5,000 soldiers and 500 Apache scouts into the desert to hunt down Geronimo. That was a quarter of the entire standing army at the time, all chasing one man and a handful of followers. And yet, despite the manpower, the technology, and the funding, they couldn't catch him. Troops followed trails that vanished overnight. They'd find evidence of his presence, A burnt-out fire, a footprint in the sand, and then nothing. Days later, they'd hear of an attack 100 miles away. The soldiers who returned from those campaigns didn't tell heroic stories. They talked about the silence. They talked about fear. One lieutenant, Charles Gatewood, spent over a year tracking Geronimo, and by the end, he wasn't chasing a man. He was being haunted by him. Gatewood later said that Geronimo could hide within 50 feet of 1,000 soldiers and never be seen. He wasn't exaggerating. This was psychological warfare, and Geronimo was a master of it. Every raid, every close call, every ambush chipped away at the Army's morale until even hardened officers began to question whether he was something more than human. But even legends get tired. By 1886, Geronimo had been fighting for more than 30 years. His people were worn down, scattered, and starving. The mountains that had once protected them now felt like cages, and every day brought another scout, another patrol, another betrayal. The U.S. government offered terms. If he surrendered, they promised he and his followers would be treated fairly. No executions, no death sentence, just peace. Geronimo didn't trust them. He had every reason not to, but he also saw no other path forward. So he agreed to a final meeting under a white flag with the one man he didn't hate, Gatewood, and prepared to step into a world he knew had no place for him. On September 4th, 1886, Geronimo surrendered for the last time. He was the final native leader to formally lay down arms, and when he did, the Indian Wars, at least on paper, came to an end. But what followed was not peace, it was punishment. Geronimo and his people were labeled prisoners of war, loaded onto trains, and shipped across the country to Florida, where they were held in exile under military guard. They were thousands of miles from home, surrounded by humidity, disease, and strange faces, and they would remain there for over 2 decades. The man who had made the U.S. Army tremble in the desert was now kept behind fences, treated as both a threat and a curiosity. In time, he became a sideshow. The Army trotted him out at public events, parading him before tourists and journalists who wanted to shake the hand of the savage they had read about in newspapers. He was displayed at the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis. He rode in President Theodore Roosevelt's inaugural parade. He signed autographs for money, posed for photos, and watched as the people who once feared him now treated him like a souvenir. But behind the image, the man remained. Geronimo wrote letters to the government, begging for one last request: to return to Arizona, to be buried in the land of his ancestors. He said he didn't want revenge anymore. He just wanted to go home. But the answer, every time, was no. They feared what his return might inspire. In 1909, while riding home on horseback, Geronimo fell in a creek and lay there all night in the cold. He developed pneumonia and died a few days later in Fort Sill, Oklahoma, still a prisoner. On his deathbed, he told his nephew that he regretted surrendering. He said he should have fought to the end. He said that giving up had been a mistake, that it had cost him everything that mattered, and then he was gone. But his story didn't end in that bed. Geronimo didn't fight for power or riches. He fought because he had been broken and refused to be erased. He fought to make sure the world would never forget what had been done to his people. And even though they tried to turn him into a villain, a relic, or a fading myth, they failed. Because when you say the name Geronimo today, you don't think of surrender. You think of someone who refused to die quietly. You think of someone who made the most powerful armies in North America chase shadows through the mountains. You think of resistance. You think of fire. And whether they meant to or not, they made him immortal.